Thanks, Volker. Thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I know it's been some time in the making for me to be able to come. This is also the first, I think, the first talk that I've given about my PhD in all of this year. So let's see if I still know what I'm talking about and if I haven't gotten rusty now that I've moved in a job that's somewhat parallel to academia. So what I want to do today is essentially give a talk that I've titled Surfacing Internet Infrastructure Politics, and really reflect on how we can study sort of the opaque politics, the problems, and the protocols that are associated with it. Next slide, please. And as was already mentioned in the introduction, I'm an anthropologist of internet infrastructure politics. Did my PhD at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm now an affiliate at the Minderoo Center for Tech and Democracy at the University of Cambridge. In my day job, I work as the vice president for the Open Tech Fund, which is an organization that supports the projects that work on human rights online. But I want to stress that today I'm not speaking in that capacity or on behalf of OTF. What I'm doing today is really drawing from my own PhD research and what that tells us about how to study internet infrastructure politics. Next slide, please. So before we actually dive into this talk, I want to tell you a little bit about why we should collectively care about how to study internet infrastructure politics. And I want to do this because I was at my first academic conference last week in Rotterdam at the Surveillance Studies Network, which, great community, absolutely wonderful. But given that I am now either, a lapsed or recovering academic, or still trying to find my new space within it, I did notice that especially when academics are amongst each other, they are not necessarily always the best in explaining upfront how their research matters beyond sort of the ongoing theoretical debates within their field, and rather to really draw out what their research means for debates about tech accountability, and how to make sure that we build a society that is broadly reflective of our values. So before I start this talk, I actually want to try and do just that. Give you a sort of a so what, or a why of why we should care about this question of internet infrastructure politics. So here we go. So for me, internet infrastructure and the organizations that run it essentially make really important decisions that shape our everyday use of the internet, and how well its functioning mediates or undermines or enables particular values, including around rights, around redistribution of resources, around equity, and around inclusion. And so I think it's really important to understand how decisions about internet infrastructure are made. And in order to do that, we also need to study the politics and the power relations that underpin it. And specifically about how people make decisions about how they're connecting this infrastructure, how they're using it, how they're governing it, and how they're building it. And over the last decade or so, I've sort of collected a little bit of experience with a variety of methods to study internet infrastructure politics. And what I want to do today is just sort of talk you through some of those so that we can collectively start thinking about how moving forward we can creatively study this particular aspect of the internet, namely the bits and pieces that you don't often see. Next slide, please. So what is internet infrastructure even? So what we see is that below the social media, below email, below all of the other apps that we tend to use on a daily basis, there is this really intricate infrastructure of companies, of governance bodies, of service providers that make the internet tick, or to be a little bit more precise, that make the internet work. And what is often lost under the somewhat seamless experience that we tend to have of the internet in Europe is the reality that the internet contains multitudes of networks, of companies, of rules, of contracts, of interests, of money that flows across it in different ways. And the internet itself, in terms of its technical functioning, consists of sort of loosely collective of networks that must cooperate to be able to enable connectivity on a global level, even if the organizations that seek out that cooperation do compete for our business, do compete for our data. Or to put it in a little bit more technical terms, the internet works because there are agreed upon rules between different companies and organizations that facilitate the interoperability between internet products that subsequently enable the exchange of information across the globe and across its infrastructure. And to make that a bit more concrete, so what does that mean for your everyday use? So for instance, if you want to watch the latest episode of Squid Games on your phone on Netflix, there's a couple of steps that takes. So it starts with Netflix making the content that's available on their app, on their platform. And when you hit play on your phone, this content, so Squid Games, moves from the Netflix servers to your consumer devices across a number of networks. These networks are actually run by different providers. That can be, for instance, British Telecom, Verizon, Turk Telecom, depending on where you live, and depending on from where the content travels. And what you see is that in the journey from Netflix to your phone, the content is actually the Squid Game sort of hops across the networks and is routed by different companies like Cisco or Huawei across their networks in ways that are made possible because these different companies have agreements with each other on how to sort of let the content hop from one network to another network. Now, what we see is that all of these different steps actually require different companies and service providers to collaborate with each other such that data can be transported from A to B or from server to your device. And all of these different steps and technologies are what I consider to be part of internet infrastructure. Now, what I'm going to try to do today in my talk is really surface the politics that shape how these different components of internet infrastructure work and whose values are prioritized through its governance. And in particular, what I want to do today is really go into the how of studying internet infrastructure rather than the why of the politics, which is something that I've written about and spoken about before. And I want to do so by drawing from my own research and the methods that I have used, in which I sort of combine ethnographic work with technical interrogation of internet infrastructure to really reveal the shape of interconnection and the politics and power relationship that underpin it. And what you see is that many people, probably not the people in this room, but in general, most people who are posting on social media or sharing messages or sending emails or giving talks over WebEx like I am today, won't necessarily think about the infrastructure that enables them to do so. Yet how that infrastructure functions has direct consequences for what is possible on the internet. And as I've spoken about and written about in the past, research about how the companies and governance bodies in charge of this infrastructure act on their responsibility to keep it functioning will help us define in what cases we should see them as legitimate political gatekeepers, and when they are acting, as I have previously called them together with Suzanne van Geuns, when they're acting as the internet's reluctant sheriffs. Next slide, please. So this talk has 4 parts. What I want to do first is set the scene by introducing some sort of recent and contentious examples of internet infrastructure companies intervening in current societal debates, so we together can sharpen our understanding of their role, especially in debates about content moderation and deplatforming. Then I want to try and give a bit of a broader, high-level overview of the prevalence of such infrastructural interventions and the questions that raises in terms of tech accountability. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the different ways in which scholars and practitioners do and can and should study these politics to formulate answers to the questions that it raises. And then I'll try and conclude with some pressing problems and outstanding research questions Slide 6, please. So I want to go through really briefly some of the definitions that I work with, because I know that these are, big terms: politics, power, protocols, etc., to get us a little bit on the same page. So for me, in my work, when I talk about internet infrastructure, I draw from the work of Plantin, and I will put some references in the end of there are references in the end of my PowerPoint. So for me, I'm referring to the aspects of the internet that are reliable, transparent, widely shared, and visible to users when they break down. And the reason why I like this particular definition is because it doesn't tend to limit internet infrastructure to a set number of technologies, right? Because it is an evolving infrastructure where new developments that you need to be able to theoretically encompass them in your thinking. And I like that kind of an expansive approach, which Christian Sandvik calls allowing you to be able to sort of include the emergent essential of the pipes, protocols, and politics, as well as the people that make the internet work, all the way from people who work on hardware to web hosting. And to make that a bit more concrete in terms of our everyday use of the internet, I am talking, for example, about companies like AWS that provide clouds, data centers that store our data, or companies like Cloudflare and Akamai who build the technology that ensure content is delivered to us super fast because they store it close to us, or people who rent and sell domain names like GoDaddy. But internet infrastructure also includes a number of well-known names that we often tend to associate with social media companies, for instance, Meta, as they are heavily investing in the development actually of the material infrastructure of the internet, putting in place new internet cables. And I just want to name that dynamic by which we see that the dynamic is often referred to as vertical integration, by which a small number of companies play an increasingly dominant role in all aspects of managing the internet and in its infrastructure, as well as in the content that is produced or the content that we produce by using their social media apps. And this is an area of study that I feel could use much more, even more attention than it's already getting, because it's incredibly important for us to understand tech power and how it's developing. Which actually brings me to the question of power. So in my work, I draw from technology anthropology Chris Kelty, who talks about power as the ability of individuals and organizations to enact their normative understanding of the moral and technical order of the internet. So essentially, these are the people that are able to translate their ideal world to the technology that they're building and subsequently to the technology that we are all using. So power for me is really about who can set and shape the political rules that govern internet infrastructure. And by politics, classic, I draw from the work of Langdon Winner, but also Laura Denardis, to sort of refer to the historically contingent relations of power and arrangement of authority as those are present within technology. And as you will see throughout this talk, I stand on the shoulder of giants. There are a number of academics whose work has absolutely fundamentally shaped my own thinking about the questions of internet infrastructure. And there are a couple that I want to name explicitly, as I understand that the group that is at this talk is mixed with people who are already super familiar with the work, but also people who are coming from different backgrounds and might be interested to know who some key reference points are. So for me, these reference points are Professor Laura Denardis, Francesca Musiani, Seda Gursis, Joss Wright, Stefania Milan, and Ashwin Matthew. There are, of course, many, many more. I mean, I could spend the entirety of my very allotted minutes to telling you who is great in this field, but I'm going to keep it at these because these are the people whose work that I've built upon. And if you're new to this topic, this is definitely where I would start. Because what is so incredibly important about these academics is they have taught me how to look at the internet through the lens of the dynamic interplay between code and culture, while also taking technology serious. So if I can have the next slide. What we see is that internet infrastructure politics are everywhere. Or as Laura Denardis always reminds us, infrastructure is politics by other means. Next slide, kindly. Most recently, we have seen this became clear when in February of this year, the Ukrainian Ministry of Digital Transformation sent a letter to the CEO of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN, the organization that is responsible for a key part of the Internet's functioning, making sure that computers can find each other through the domain name system. In the letter, the ministry states, or the minister states, I'm sending you this letter on behalf of the people of Ukraine to ask you to address an urgent need to introduce strict sanctions against the Russian Federation in the field of DNS regulation in response to its act of aggression towards Ukraine and its citizens. Specifically, the ministry wanted ICANN to revoke Russia's top-level domains like .ru, as well as a number of other technical actions which would make it very hard for people to access websites ending in .ru. So imagine that, they had asked for people to say, like, let's remove .com or .de. This is a big fundamental ask. The ministry had argued that doing so would actually help stop the spread of Russian information about the war in Ukraine. But ICANN and a number of other internet governance organizations that had actually received similar requests argued that it was too slippery of a slope and that kicking Russian domain names off the internet, or that like making these harder to access would in equal measure actually hurt the ability of Russians to gain access to important information and media outlets. Next slide. And what is interesting is that this particular example, the use of internet infrastructure for particular political agendas, sometimes more reasonable than other times, is actually the rule, not the exception. Laura Denardis wrote her first sort of books about this happening in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. So by no means is the problem that we're talking about today a new one. But it is one that is getting more and more entrenched as the internet is becoming more and more important. And as the work of both Laura Denardis and Francesca Musiani and others studying sort of the turn to the infrastructure by governments in internet governance have shown over the last decades that this is something that we need to formulate a good answer to, is like how we factor this into politics and what we expect from these governance bodies or the companies behind them. And what I want to do is sort of give you a bit of a world tour of some additional examples that essentially demonstrate the growing role of infrastructure, to give you a sense of the breadth of the role that these governance bodies and the companies behind them play as gatekeepers to information, to content, and to internet access. Next slide. So a couple of examples. So what we've seen recently, comparatively recently, and I'm coming at this from the perspective of company-driven decisions. There are also many examples of government forcing companies to sort of disconnect or take down or in different ways control information. That is not something I'm talking about today. My concern at this point is with company-driven decisions. So what we saw is that one of the largest cloud providers temporarily suspended its web hosting services to Parler. Parler is the social media platform that runs itself as a bit of a free speech and right-wing alternative to Twitter. And so they were suspended in the wake of the storming of the US Capitol in January 2021 because Amazon AWS decision and was essentially meant that this website was temporarily rendered offline. And Amazon actually made this decision over the violent and threatening content that was on Parler's platform. And it's interesting because like this particular decision was a policy decision from below, from the infrastructure up, so to speak, as opposed to, for instance, following from a top-down government mandated regulation. And what we saw is in the summer before that, so the summer of 2019, 2 years before that, what's time even anymore, a well-known content delivery network company that I've mentioned earlier that helps store content near people such that it gets to your device faster, actually suspended its services to a messaging board called 8chan in the wake of a mass shooting in the US. in which the messaging board was used by the shooter to share his racist screed, his racist manifesto, and for others to cheer him on. And there are more and more examples that I go into. And what is interesting is that these examples capture a growing trend of infrastructural interventions whereby companies decide that certain content or services breach their internal rules, or they experience pressure from society that, enabling particular content is not acceptable. And subsequently, they act as arbiters of what is acceptable and accessible by way of their power of the infrastructure on which this content relies. And to bring this full circle, so coming back to the example of the war in Ukraine and the role of internet infrastructure providers there, what we have also seen since the beginning of this year is a number of internet infrastructure companies stating that they would leave Russia, that they would be withdrawing their services from Russia. And they didn't just say that they were going to temporarily cut their contracts, but they were actively going to rescind their services by leaving the country. Or, and this is where it gets really interesting, they said they would be leaving Russia and the Russian market. So the fact that they've said this is actually incredibly meaningful, because some of the companies who said this were some of the largest carriers of traffic out of Russia, and these were American companies mostly. So the decision to actually leave the country or stop providing services would potentially have an impact not just on Russian connectivity, but on worldwide internet working. Because data, it tends to, or routing happens by picking the fastest, most efficient route. It doesn't necessarily take into consideration, am I hopping from Russia to Ukraine, or am I hopping over which different networks? It tends to, in that sense, not be guided by the sort of national boundaries that you and I all have to deal with when we have to show our passports in different ways. And the interesting thing is, when these companies made these announcements, there were a number of researchers who are actually looking at the impact of this decision to disconnect. And at least in the initial wake of these statements, they saw no impact. And that's because many of the companies who said, we're going to stop providing our services in Russia, actually hadn't done so. Now, please keep these various tidbits of information in mind. As I discuss a number of interesting approaches, I think at least, for the study of infrastructural politics. And again, in doing so, I'm going to be drawing from my PhD research, which combines ethnographic work as well as technical measurements to really understand and follow up to see what is happening to internet connectivity. And next slide. So, how do we study infrastructural politics? Especially given that many service providers are less public about their decisions in the way that, for instance, social media companies are, because social media companies are so visible, because they are so much in the public eye in a way that infrastructure companies are to a lesser extent.
Now, one way of doing this is by reading the statements, the blogs, the policy, the transparency reports, etc., that these infrastructure companies publish. One of the issues there, however, is that because many of these companies are business to business in nature, rather than being more public-facing, like social media companies that run and rely on their services, there are fewer public resources for us to study. And it's only recently, for example, that Cloudflare, which is a well-known content delivery network, for example, has started releasing transparency reports. And up until this point, at least to the extent of my knowledge, they are the only CDN company to do so. So, if we cannot easily draw from information in the public domain, where do we go to study how these infrastructural companies function? Now, in my PhD research, I found one viable avenue, which is that many of these companies partake in a number of semi-open governance bodies, places like the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, which was at the heart of my PhD. Now, these bodies are interesting because they are comparatively open. And even though companies participate within them, focused on sort of the particular parts of the internet that they focus on, I did find these bodies to be a really interesting way to understand how people in these companies and within these governance bodies think about the internet and internet politics. So, document analysis to understand what companies say publicly, and comparing that to insights drawn from ethnography and interviews to actually understand how company decisions are key parts of the puzzle of servicing infrastructure politics. But another important part, and one that I have found to be comparatively underutilized, especially by social scientists, is drawing insights from the various projects and collectives that perform a range of internet measurements. Now, internet measurements refers to the field of research that actually looks to the internet and measures its connectivity, its reachability, and essentially maps its topology. And there are different aspects of the internet that can be measured, including its performance, routing of data, shutdowns, so what is and is not accessible at what time, the way its networks are connected, topology, and many other things that can also be looked at through measurements. And the interesting thing about these measurements is that they provide us essentially the closest thing to a dynamic map of the public internet. The various networks that it consists of and how these networks internetwork. Now, some important examples are, for instance, the Open Observatory of Network Interference, or UNI, the Internet Outage Detection and Analysis Project, or IOTA, Censored Planet at the University of Michigan, and RIPE Atlas. And just a quick caveat, the Open Tech Fund, where I work, has actually supported a number of these different organizations, but I've been working with and learning from their data long before I joined OTF as their Vice President of Research. Next slide. So where do we go to figure out what is actually happening on the internet and what is happening to internet connectivity? And how do we compare these measurements to what companies are saying? Well, obviously, it to a certain extent depends on which companies we're talking about and what exactly they're saying. But, for instance, if you're interested in understanding whether particular apps or websites are blocked or censored in certain countries, as was recently the case when Russia limited access to a number of Western social media companies, you can do so through the tools provided by UNI. And UNI in that sense is particularly interesting as they have set up tools such that you don't actually need to be very technically savvy to use them.
And in a similar vein, if you are interested in understanding local internet shutdowns, for instance, parts of a country that are experiencing internet connectivity limitations, you can do so via IOTA. And if you are interested in figuring out sort of if large internet service providers have or have not left Russia, there are a number of options for looking at whether they have stopped what is called peering or disconnected transit. Next slide, and then the next slide again. Thank you. So going back to what I mentioned earlier, there is a real need to combine these various sources of information to surface internet infrastructure politics creatively. As I mentioned, when multiple internet service providers announced that they would be leaving Russia in response to the war in Ukraine, many people hotly debated that decision. Civil society statements were written, journalists wrote really interesting pieces about it, politicians were nervous, academics took to Twitter, and then, we really know that the interesting debates start to express a lot of concern about or support for the decision. But in that process, especially in the initial kerfuffle after those statements were made, there were not a whole lot of people who actually dove into the details as to what was going on the internet. And I saw that especially on more of the journalistic side, a number of people took the statements at face value. And it's always tricky to sort of expect companies to walk the talk, especially in fraught situations like the war in Ukraine. And what I and others who sort of triangulate between these different data sources, so between ethnographic contexts and contexts, company statements and the technical measurements, capturing connectivity directly after the statements, what we saw again was like not that much. So essentially, initially, there was little by way of what we could see, at least, through the internet measurements that suggested there was any radical restructuring of traffic leaving Russia. Now, it's important to understand what that data does and doesn't tell us. Now, this particular example and this reality doesn't necessarily, shouldn't necessarily be seen as these companies sort of purposefully saying one thing whilst doing another. I think it's much more subtle in the sense that, the sense that I got at least is that following the initial US sanctions, following the initial developments in the war, many American companies were really nervous about staying in Russia. But eventually, as they got a better sense of the contours of what was going on, as well as the insistence of the US White House that it was key for Russians to keep having access to the open internet, these companies might not have felt the need to urgently or abruptly halt their services to or even within Russia. And I spoke to one industry representative who sort of put it like this. He said, well, it's likely that these initial statements were sort of drawn up by the lawyers as tightly as possible in response to what was going on, but that as things developed, it turned out that the initial reaction might have been too careful, too heavy-handed, and they were able to sort of walk it back a little bit. Now, I have no definitive answer in this particular case, but what you can see is that comparing different data sources, company statements, with conversations with industry experts, with what we see happening to different networks that make up the internet, does provide like a detailed and nuanced picture of what we can know and not know. More so than just saying like, oh, these companies said they were going to be leaving, so we should all be up in arms about that in different ways. Likewise, regarding some of the earlier examples I raised around cloud providers and content delivery networks cutting their contracts with social media companies, we do tend to see to a certain extent that like when the uproar dies down, these contracts get reinstated, or these sort of contentious social media platforms find other providers for the infrastructural services that they need. Now, all of this to say that when we take a close look at the politics of internet infrastructure, we see this ever-changing set of contextual practices, rather than a single or consistently applied set of politics. Likewise, what it also shows is that we cannot take company statements at face value, but we must really improve our ability to understand network connectivity in the context of company culture and vice versa. So company culture in the context of connectivity. And this is tricky because it means that there's a lot of work to do each time such an event happens. And I mean, I guess that's good because it means that all of us, there will always be work for us to do or to fund, as I do in my day job. Next slide. So to round everything up, you can go on. These are my references. So to round everything up, I know that I've touched on a wide range of issues today, sort of from the politics of internet infrastructure, the actors involved, the impact of these often lesser visible parts of the internet, to a number of methods and data sources and ways to combine these to sort of peer down the internet's infrastructure or under the internet's hood. And what I hope is that if you take one thing away from today's talk, it is that we can neither draw direct conclusions from what companies say they will do without checking what they actually are doing. I've hopefully also pointed people who are somewhat more new to this field or don't come from a technical background in the direction of a plethora of wonderful technical communities like UNI, like IOTA, like Sensor Planet, like RIBE Atlas, that provide data about internet infrastructure as well as some potential options for getting ethnographic access to these more opaque internet infrastructure companies through semi-open internet governance organizations. But primarily, I hope that I've made a really strong case for bringing together these various data sources to really critically interrogate infrastructural politics. Very often, researchers have mastered one or maybe two aspects, the document analysis, the ethnography, or the technical mastery that comes with internet measurements. But it's still comparatively rare when people can actually bring these various pieces together to tell the necessarily complex, often very messy story of internet infrastructure politics. And I hope in this talk that I've provided both the inspiration as well as some of the tools for people to start telling more of those stories. Thank you so much.